Hi everyone, this is Aaron Thompson. I'm a assistant professor of natural resource planning at UW Stevens Point. I'm also a extension specialist with the Center for Land Use Education. Um, Tonight I was supposed to go ahead and join you at your meeting over in Eau Claire, and unfortunately road conditions got in the way. The weather turned on me a little bit. I made it about halfway before I decided it was probably time to turn back around before I came one of those that ended up in the ditch. And so, anyway, really, my piece of this overall project, the social science component of this, is really just trying to plug in how do we bring farmers' voices into this process? And so I do a lot of work around the state focused on using social science to inform watershed planning. But one of the areas that I'm particularly passionate about is that how do we bring kind of these rural landowners or these rural farming voices into this discussion as we develop natural resource planning. So I'm just going to go ahead and run through the brief introduction I'd planned for this evening, just to give you an idea, some background on what it is I'm doing. And then I'm also going to go ahead and send along a copy of the survey just as a starting point for the discussion, the types of things that we'll be asking to get some information and feedback from the farmers. I include this slide just as an introduction. I mentioned in the previous slide that my role in this particular project is as the social science consultant on this project. But most of the work that I do really revolves around this idea of landscape level planning. So landscape level conservation planning, watershed planning. And for me, really what that means is that we're applying social ecological analysis to support natural resource management initiatives. That's one of the things I think that's really exciting about this particular project. Certainly some of the eval modeling that's going to be able to be done to help support targeting. I'll talk about that here a little bit more in the slides that are coming up. But a lot of this comes down to balancing the multiple demands, both in terms of the needs of the landscape, but also the priorities of those who live in it. And the other component of landscape planning is that in my mind, it really requires social science. And what I mean by that is that in a lot of our landscape planning efforts, what we're often missing is we're missing information about those the stakeholders, specifically those landowners who are going to be affected by our decision-making process. And so, a lot of my work, and I'll mention some very specific examples coming up here in the following slides. A lot of my work is really about how do we include their voices in this process. I'm involved in a lot of different types of projects around the state, and one of the places that I'm working right now is with the Lake Wausau Association. And basically what I'm doing for this particular group is I'm helping them kind of break down kind of the urban residents and their views of Lake Wausau. So this slide is one of four dominant belief systems that we actually found amongst residents who live around this lake. But I just wanted to drop this in here as an example of work that can be done to break down the stakeholders and to understand the different beliefs that they have towards the resource that we're managing. In addition to kind of the stakeholder involvement work that I've done in places like Lake Wausau, one of the other areas that I'm really passionate about is, again, how do we bring farmers' voices into conservation efforts? And a lot of that for me is about how do we use an understanding of rural landowners' attitudes to identify willing partners. Who is it that's most likely to work with us, and or how do we reach those landowners that have the pieces of property that we need to see a change in land management practices. And so for me, a lot of this is how do we meet farmers where they're at, and how can we use the type of information I collect to inform the approach that we take so that they feel included in this process. I'm not going to linger long on this slide, but I do want to go ahead and just point out kind of where my work, where this social information kind of fits into the overall process. From my perspective, one of the most exciting parts about the EauClaireRiver watershed planning process that we're kicking off here is that here's an opportunity to really test out some of the most innovative ideas about targeting conservation practices. And what I mean by that is within any given watershed, there's many different possible locations where we could put limited conservation dollars on the ground, right? And so we could implement practices on these pieces of land. But through biophysical science and realistically through tools like the eval model, we can do a much better job of putting practices, of picking out the lands where these practices will have the biggest return on our investment. Going one step beyond that, what we can actually do is we can use social science, and so the work that I'm doing, to help us inform, or help us select out who are the most willing landowners, right? Those that share the common goals with this planning process and with kind of what we're trying to accomplish. Hopefully through that process we can actually achieve more efficient conservation. And in an ideal world, what we can start to do with that is that we can link social data to spatial data. And so this is an example of some work that I've done previously. This is actually from my hometown, and so this is on the Wabash River in Indiana. And we were actually able to conduct a census of farmers who lived within the county and figure out this underlying support for different environmental outcomes. And so this map shows you and kind of highlights some of the areas where we saw strong support for conservation objectives. Through this process, we can actually go ahead and target in on those landowners who are most willing to participate in our efforts, and perhaps avoid those who are most likely to be unsupportive or unwilling to participate in the efforts. This is a bigger challenge, because sometimes the places where we need to put conservation are also the places where we have the least support for it. And so there's a kind of a dual role in my work, is that one, finding the most willing partners is important, but two, if we find that we need to target specific lands and areas where there's less support for what we're trying to do, how should we go about reaching them? Who's the right person to approach them? What's the right message to bring to them, and what are the right incentive packages that we need to put together in order to get them to implement these practices? There's a really rich literature out there on what motivates farmers to participate in conservation behavior, and it certainly goes beyond what I'm going to share right now. But there are a couple of key points I want to highlight real quick. First off, we know that focusing on increasing profits, so the economic factor here, doesn't explain farmers' willingness to participate in conservation programs. It's more complex than that. And part of that complexity is that we know that conservation and conservation behaviors are tied up in farmers' values, beliefs, and attitudes, right? So there's more going on in this process. A couple of the key places that we look to, the indicators of willingness to support conservation practices or become involved in this, certainly it comes down to a farmer's view of themselves as a steward of their land, and the farmer's view of government partners or government involvement in land management activities. And we'll talk more about this in just a minute. To expand on what I mean by these key attitudes, so this environmental stewardship and government involvement variables that we explore, I just want you to take a look at the graphic here. This graphic is an attempt to show what it is I'm trying to do as a social scientist. In a lot of ways, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to use these key attitudes to try and group farmers with others who believe, who share similar beliefs. What the graphic is showing you is on the vertical axis, you have kind of this environmental stewardship, going from what I would describe as someone who sees himself as a steward. It's labeled here as alternative views of environmental stewardship, versus somebody who sees their farm much more as a business, which would be a conventional view. On the horizontal axis, what you see is we see views that go from seeing the government as a partner in managing their farm to somebody who's much more focused on individual property rights. And what you can see from this is that there are these four, and realistically we'll find more of a neutral category here in a minute, these 5 different groups that they engage with conservation in very different ways. This is what I'll be helping kind of explore, hopefully here in the Eau Claire watershed as well. While my involvement in the Eau Claire River watershed planning process is much more of a pilot study looking at a very small group of farmers, I did want to go ahead and just kind of point back to where has this science evolved from? Where's the research kind of founded in? And certainly there's been other studies, and I've got some Wisconsin examples I can share as well. But one of the places this, for me, really builds off of is some work that I did in Indiana. And this is while I was at Purdue University. And this was a survey of farmers who lived along the Wabash River. And so I mentioned this study a couple slides ago, but in this particular study, we were able to exert a lot of effort and spend a lot of resources, realistically, to get a 60% response rate. Most of our work really, we shoot for about a 30% response rate with the type of mail survey work that we do. But there are ways that we can improve on that. And what we found in the study of farmers in the Wabash River watershed was that we actually identified not just the 4 categories I showed you in the graphic before, but we actually found 5 different categories. And basically what that 5th category was is that we found some that weren't that these attitudes, these key attitudes, weren't the polarizing factors. And so we know that there's other things at play. But for the remainder of farmers, what we were able to do then was we were able to break them down into these 4 groups. And the 4 groups reflect, different belief systems related to conservation practices. And so I'll point out a couple here. So category 2, these government-averse, production-focused farmers, how they relate to conservation programs and practices is very different than category 3, the willing partners who are conservation-focused. In a lot of ways, category 3 is the easiest group that we could possibly approach about conservation practices. They already want to work with government partners, and conservation is something that they're actively doing or actively want to pursue on their land. We'll go ahead and pick up how we can include these different belief systems or these different ways that farmers view conservation practices, how we can use that information to reach these farmers here in just a minute. The next couple slides are really going to focus on how do we use this information. How do we use an understanding of farmers' attitudes? And so a lot of this for me is about identifying strategies for engaging these different landowners' perspectives, right? How do we meet farmers where they're at? So in order to do this, I've spent a lot of time looking at different strategies. And one of the ways that I've done this is that I've asked a lot of different farmers, both in surveys and also in focus groups and other meetings, to give me their response to a simple question, which is, what do you believe is the most important issue facing the rural landscape, and how do you think it should be addressed? And the responses I gave allowed me to go ahead and feed this back to farmers and go ahead and explore. So meeting with groups of farmers that represented category 2, or these government-averse, production-focused farmers. I'm just going to present a couple of examples here. What I found in presenting these statements back to them is that this group of farmers shared these 3 areas up here identified under perspectives of planning. They agreed on these 3 items. 1, that decisions shouldn't be left to local officials, that the approach should emphasize regular meetings and provide small groups of neighboring landowners with incentives to work together, and lastly, that at some level the focus has to include improving the quality of working lands. If you're going to address water quality, you also have to bring that in from a way of improving the quality of working lands. Right? This is their belief, and this is how we meet them where they're at. And as another illustration, here's group 4. Group 4 is a really important group in my mind because this is a group that's government averse but also conservation focused, meaning that we're probably not reaching this group through our normal pathways, right? They're unlikely to be working actively with the county land conservation department. They likely avoid the federal agencies as well, but they share a belief in conservation, right? And so identifying pathways to get to this group becomes really important for watershed efforts. And so again, focusing here on the top, on the red box at the top under perspectives for planning, what we learned from them is that they believe that experts should not be allowed to determine solutions without input from stakeholders. And what we see, again, that collaborative focus on planning, that the approach needs to emphasize regular meetings. And here's another key factor is that in whatever you're doing, the focus needs to be on protecting key environmental areas. Again, conservation focused, but they're government averse. How do we reach them? There are 2 objectives that I'll be working on as part of this study. And the first one here really focuses in on trying to determine what is working within the watershed already. I know that there's a lot of work, county, state, federal, nonprofit work that's going on that others who are already reaching out to farmers, what's been successful, what hasn't, and can we pull some lessons from this? At the bottom of the page here, you'll see a couple of lessons, and these are ones that I use kind of as my generic starting point. When people ask me, how do we improve relations, how do we get farmers involved in conservation practices, needing to meet them where they're at or create opportunities for dialogue, and or getting them involved through efforts like farmer-led water quality sampling. These are great initiatives, but we need, I need to, coming from the outside especially, I need an understanding of what is and isn't working, right? I know that things have been tried, and I'd like to go ahead and pull it together, kind of a list that I can share with everyone about success stories that, from all of you, that maybe we can replicate down the road. And lastly, the second objective, probably kind of the primary emphasis of the work that I'll be doing in the watershed, is really focused on how can we add some level of understanding of kind of these social factors into the eval process. And again, this goes back to that targeting slide. Is that how can we use social data to be more efficient with targeting, and or how do we use social information to help us understand how to approach farmers within a particular area. And so that's what we'll be working on. This is all tied to the survey that I'll be sending out as a resource for you to start taking a look at. I certainly appreciate feedback on that. Any questions that anyone has, certainly feel free to get in touch with me. My contact information is listed here at the bottom of the slide. I hope to hear from you. Thanks a lot.